Hello, night seekers, and welcome to Midnight Scary Storyteller, a place where forgotten tales and gentle voices guide you softly into sleep, wrapped in mystery and shadow. Before tonight's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below. I always love seeing where these midnight stories find their way. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's drift together into the unknown. I used to work for Child Protective Services, and that job changed the way I see the world forever. Before I started, I believed that most people were basically good. I knew terrible things happened, of course, but I assumed they were rare exceptions. After working in CPs, I realized there are people living among us who seem completely different from everyone else. They look ordinary. They hold jobs. They have families. They smile, joke, and carry on conversations like anyone else. But behind that normal appearance, some of them seem completely empty. It's difficult to describe unless you've encountered it firsthand. It's not just cruelty. It's not simply anger. It's the complete absence of empathy. The absence of guilt. The absence of any emotional connection to another human being. Some people hurt children because they're overwhelmed, addicted, or trapped in cycles of abuse that span generations. Those situations are heartbreaking in their own way. But then there are the cases that are different. The ones involving people who appear to enjoy causing suffering. People who manipulate everyone around them, who carefully hide what they're doing, who spend years building an image of themselves as trustworthy while secretly abusing the most vulnerable people they can find. Those were always the hardest cases to process. They're often incredibly intelligent, patient, calculated. They know exactly how to avoid suspicion. They understand how to manipulate family members, neighbors, teachers, and sometimes even professionals. They don't act impulsively. They wait. They watch. They look for opportunities when they believe no one will notice. By the time they're finally caught, the abuse may have been happening for years. That's one of the hardest truths I learned while working in child protection. The worst offenders rarely look like the monsters people imagine. If they did, they'd be caught much sooner. Instead, they often appear completely ordinary. Sometimes they're respected members of the community. Sometimes they're the parent who always volunteers at school. Sometimes they're the relative everyone trusts. Sometimes they're the person who seems charming every time you meet them. That's what makes them so dangerous. One case in particular has never left me. Even after all these years, I still think about it. I remember sitting at my desk reviewing a child's file. As part of the investigation, I was looking through her family history, trying to understand the relationships within the household. Then I noticed something that made me stop. I checked it again because I assumed I had misunderstood. I hadn't. According to the records, the girl's biological father was also her grandfather. I remember just staring at the paperwork for a long time. Even after working difficult cases, there are moments that completely overwhelm you. That was one of them. You know what those words mean. You understand exactly what had to happen for a family tree to look like that, and suddenly the paperwork stops being paperwork. It becomes the story of a child whose life had already been shaped by unimaginable abuse before she was even old enough to understand the world around her. Moments like that stay with you. People often ask those who work in child protection how they handle seeing so many terrible things. The honest answer is that you don't always handle it. You carry it with you. You learn to keep functioning. You go home, you eat dinner, you smile at your family, but some files stay in your mind forever. Some names never disappear. Some photographs become impossible to forget. Working in CPs also taught me something important. Not every abusive parent is the same. Some genuinely love their children, but are trapped in addiction, untreated mental illness, or overwhelming circumstances. They still need to be held accountable, but they're different from the people who deliberately plan, manipulate, and enjoy harming children. Those individuals are thankfully rare, but when you encounter one, you never forget them. They're unlike anything most people will ever experience. The hardest part is realizing that, on the surface, they often appear completely normal. If you passed them in a grocery store, you'd never know. You might smile at them, hold the door open for them, never realizing what they're capable of. That realization changes your perspective forever. It doesn't make you paranoid, but it does make you appreciate how important it is for professionals, teachers, doctors, neighbors, and family members to take concerns seriously when a child asks for help or shows signs that something isn't right. Children rarely have the power to protect themselves. They depend on adults to notice, to listen, to believe them. Looking back, I don't think the job made me lose faith in humanity. For every person capable of unimaginable cruelty, I also met foster parents, social workers, detectives, teachers, doctors, counselors, and ordinary neighbors who dedicated their lives to protecting children they had never even met. They reminded me that there is far more compassion in the world than cruelty. But the cruelty does exist, and once you've seen it up close, there are certain case files you'll never forget. For me, one of those moments will always be sitting at my desk, staring at a family tree, and realizing that a little girl's father was also her grandfather. I've read thousands of pages of case files throughout my career. That single page is still one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. When I was in my late 20s, I had just started a new job and was in the middle of moving into a new apartment. There was one small problem, though. My lease didn't begin for another few weeks, so I needed somewhere to stay in the meantime. My sister offered to let me sleep on the couch in her living room until my apartment was ready. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it saved me from paying for a hotel or trying to find another temporary place to live. Her house was in a quiet, well-kept neighborhood where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of street where people waved to their neighbors, kids played outside during the day, and everyone felt perfectly safe. The couch I slept on sat against the front wall of the living room, only a few feet from the large front window facing the street. Every night, that couch became my bed. After a long day at work, I'd come home, watch a little TV, stretch out on the couch, and fall asleep. It became my routine. One Friday night, just as I was getting ready to settle in, my phone rang. It was my ex-girlfriend. We had broken up quite a while before, but we'd stayed on good terms. We weren't trying to get back together, and this definitely wasn't some late-night hookup call. The moment I answered, I knew something wasn't right. She sounded terrified. Her voice was shaky, and it sounded like she'd been crying. She apologized for calling so late, but said she couldn't calm herself down. She kept saying she had this overwhelming feeling that something terrible was about to happen, not something specific. She hadn't seen anyone outside. No one had threatened her. She just couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't safe. It was one of those feelings that didn't seem logical, but felt completely real to her. She asked if I could come over. Since it was the weekend and I didn't have to work the next morning, I figured there wasn't any reason to say no. Even if all she needed was someone to sit with her until she calmed down, that seemed like enough. So I grabbed my keys and drove across town. When I got there, we spent a while talking. I reassured her that everything was probably okay. We watched some television, talked about life, and gradually she relaxed. Eventually she stopped worrying, and the night passed without anything unusual happening. There were no strange sounds, no emergency, no intruder. Nothing happened at all. The next morning we made breakfast, laughed a little about how frightened she'd been the night before, and I headed back to my sister's house. As I pulled into the driveway, something immediately caught my attention. There was a note left for us. It said we needed to contact the police. My first thought was that maybe someone had backed into the mailbox, or there had been some kind of neighborhood incident. I certainly wasn't expecting what they told us. When we called, the officer explained that sometime during the night, after I had left, a group of teenagers had driven through the neighborhood, firing a handgun at random houses. There wasn't any personal motive behind it. They weren't targeting specific people. They weren't trying to break into homes. They had simply driven down the street shooting at houses for no reason anyone could understand. It sounded completely unreal. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where something like that happened. People didn't worry about random gunfire. It was quiet, peaceful, safe, or at least everyone believed it was. The officer told us my sister's house had been hit 3 times. After the call, we went inside to see the damage. That's when I felt my stomach drop. All 3 bullets had entered through the front of the house. Every one of them ended up in the living room. More specifically, every one of them struck the couch where I had been sleeping every single night. Not the kitchen. Not another bedroom. Not somewhere farther inside the house. The couch. The exact spot where my head and body would normally have been. I just stood there staring at the bullet holes. It was difficult to process. I couldn't stop imagining what would have happened if I'd stayed home that night like I originally planned. The timing was almost impossible to believe. If my ex hadn't called, I would have gone to sleep on that couch exactly like I had every other night. Instead, I happened to be somewhere else. That one phone call changed everything. People have asked me over the years whether I think my ex somehow sensed what was going to happen. I honestly don't know. I've never considered myself someone who believes in psychic abilities or supernatural premonitions. Maybe she simply had a panic attack that happened to occur on the same night something completely unrelated took place. Coincidences happen. Sometimes they're unbelievably strange. Sometimes they're so unlikely they almost don't seem real. This feels like one of those coincidences. Whatever the explanation, one fact has never changed. Had I ignored my phone, had I decided I was too tired to drive across town, had I told her we'd talk in the morning, I would have been asleep on that couch. The bullets didn't just hit the house. They hit the exact place where I would have been lying. That realization has stayed with me for years. Looking back, it's amazing how ordinary that entire evening felt while it was happening. It was just a late-night phone call, a short drive, helping someone I still cared about feel safe. Having breakfast the next morning, there wasn't a single moment that seemed unusual until I got back to my sister's house. Only then did I realize how close I had come to something that could have changed my life forever. It also changed the way I think about everyday decisions. Most of the choices we make seem insignificant. Should I answer the phone? Should I stay home? Should I go out? Usually, the answer doesn't matter very much. But every once in a while, one small decision ends up changing the entire course of your life, and you don't realize it until afterward. Even today, it's still the strangest experience I've ever had. Not because I believe anything paranormal happened. Not because I think someone predicted the future. But because every time I remember those 3 bullet holes lined up across the couch where I should have been sleeping, I'm reminded of just how fragile life really is. Sometimes the difference between an ordinary morning and a terrible tragedy is nothing more than answering a phone call that almost went unanswered. When I was in my late 20s, I had just started a new job and was in the middle of moving. My lease on a new apartment hadn't started yet, so for a few weeks my sister let me crash on the couch in her living room. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. Her house was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. The couch sat against the front wall of the living room, just a few feet from the large front window facing the street. Every night, that was where I slept. It became my temporary bedroom until I could move into my own place. One weekend, late at night, my phone rang. It was my ex-girlfriend. We had broken up some time earlier, but we'd managed to stay friends. There wasn't anything romantic going on between us anymore, and this definitely wasn't one of those come-over calls. The moment I answered, I could tell something was wrong. She sounded shaken, almost in tears. She told me she couldn't explain it, but she had an overwhelming feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She wasn't talking about a specific threat or anything she'd seen. It was just a feeling, an intense sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She asked if I could come over. It happened to be the weekend, and since I didn't have work the next morning, I figured there was no reason not to. I drove over to her place. We talked for a while. I tried to reassure her that everything was probably fine. Eventually, she calmed down. I stayed the night, but nothing unusual happened. No emergency. No strange noises. No break-in. The next morning, we had breakfast together, laughed a little about how frightened she'd been the night before, and I headed back to my sister's house. As I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed something unusual. There was a note waiting for us. It instructed us to contact the police as soon as possible. That wasn't exactly the welcome I expected after spending a quiet night away. We called. The officer explained what had happened. Sometime after I had left the previous evening, a group of teenagers had driven down the street firing a handgun at random houses. It wasn't targeted. They weren't trying to rob anyone. They were simply driving around shooting at homes for no reason anyone could understand. The whole thing sounded surreal. This wasn't a rough neighborhood. It was the kind of quiet residential area where kids played outside and neighbors knew one another. Violence like that simply didn't happen there. According to the police, my sister's house had been hit 3 times. After speaking with them, we went inside to see the damage for ourselves. That's when the reality of what had happened really hit me. All 3 bullets had entered the living room. Every single one of them struck the couch. Not another room, not the walls farther away. The couch. The exact place where I'd been sleeping every night. If I hadn't gone to my ex's house, I almost certainly would have been lying there when those shots came through the front of the house. Standing there looking at the bullet holes, I couldn't stop imagining it. The timing, the angle, the fact that they all hit the same piece of furniture. It was impossible not to think about how differently that night could have ended. People often ask whether I think my ex somehow sensed what was going to happen. Honestly, I don't know. I'm not someone who usually believes in premonitions or anything supernatural. Maybe it was just an extraordinary coincidence. Maybe her anxiety happened to peak on the exact night something completely unrelated occurred. Statistically, strange coincidences happen every day. Most of them just aren't this dramatic. Whatever the explanation, I know one thing. If she hadn't called me that night, I would have been asleep on that couch. That's not speculation. That's simply where I had been sleeping every night until then. The bullets didn't hit somewhere nearby. They hit exactly where I would have been. That realization has stayed with me ever since. Looking back, it's strange how ordinary the entire evening felt. A phone call, a short drive across town, helping an old friend calm down. Breakfast the next morning. Nothing about it felt important at the time. Only afterward did it become one of the most significant nights of my life. It's funny how life works sometimes. We spend so much time worrying about the decisions we make. Should I go? Should I stay home? Should I answer the phone? Most of the time, those choices don't matter very much. Every now and then, though, a completely ordinary decision changes everything. To this day, it's still the closest I've ever come to something that makes me question coincidence. I don't know whether my ex's fear meant anything. I don't know why she chose that particular night to call. I don't know why those teenagers decided to drive down that street firing a pistol into random homes. All I know is that 3 bullets ended up in the exact spot where I should have been sleeping. And because I answered one late-night phone call, I wasn't there. It's easily the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. Not because I think it was paranormal, but because every time I picture those bullet holes in that couch, I'm reminded of how incredibly thin the line between an ordinary night and a life-changing tragedy can really be. My family has a story that still gets brought up from time to time because of how disturbing it is. Unlike most true crime stories you hear online, this one hit close to home. It involved the uncle of a family friend, and even years later, people around here still remember it. The crime happened in an apartment in Colby, Wisconsin, and it eventually became well known enough to be featured on the television series I Killed My Buff, Season 2, Episode 3, titled The Butcher. The victim was a man named Robert Pogue. From everything my family has told me, the people involved had all known each other for years. Robert and another man, Dean Allen, had once been close friends. At some point, however, everything fell apart. Robert ended up running away with Dean's wife, Janice Allen. What had once been a friendship turned into betrayal, resentment, and anger. For a while, Robert and Janice lived together. From the outside, it probably looked like they had simply started a new life together. Most people assumed that whatever had happened between the 3 of them was a private matter that would eventually settle down with time. Instead, it became the beginning of something much darker. According to what was later uncovered during the investigation, Janice eventually contacted Dean. She reportedly told him that she regretted leaving with Robert and wanted him to come get her. Whether she truly meant it, or whether she was manipulating both men, is something only she really knew. Dean made the trip to the apartment in Colby. Instead of confronting Robert and walking away, events took an unimaginable turn. Rather than acting as enemies, Dean and Janice ended up working together. Together, they murdered Robert. Even knowing the basic facts is unsettling. But what happened afterward is somehow even worse. Instead of calling the police or trying to hide what had happened in a panic, they made deliberate decisions that shocked everyone who later learned the details of the case. Investigators discovered that Robert's body had been dismembered after the murder. His remains were placed into garbage bags. Those bags were then taken away from the apartment and discarded in different locations along highways throughout the county in an apparent attempt to make identification and recovery more difficult. It's the kind of detail that stays with you long after you hear it. Cases involving murder are tragic enough on their own, but the effort taken afterward makes the crime feel especially cold and calculated. One part of the story has always stood out in my family because of how strangely close it came to people we knew. If I'm remembering correctly, the father of one of the guys I graduated from high school with worked on the investigation. I was told he played an important role in interviewing Janice during the case. The story that has been passed around for years is that she developed some kind of obsession with him during the investigation. She supposedly believed that he cared about her and imagined that he would somehow help her avoid responsibility. According to the story I heard, she became convinced they would eventually leave together once she was free. Whether that was genuine delusion, manipulation, or something else entirely, I can't say for certain. What I do know is that investigators eventually obtained a confession, and that interview became one of the major turning points in solving the case. Whenever someone tells that part of the story, it sounds almost unbelievable. It's one of those strange details that seems like it belongs in a movie rather than a real homicide investigation. Another eerie detail comes from my own family. My dad once told me that years before the murder happened, he had actually been inside the apartment where it later took place. He said he had been there during parties long before anyone could have imagined what would eventually happen inside those walls. That detail has always bothered me more than I expected. It's strange to think about how ordinary places can suddenly become tied forever to terrible events. An apartment can simply be a place where friends gather, laugh, and spend time together. Then, after one terrible night, people stop seeing it as an apartment at all. It becomes known only as the place where someone died. Every room takes on a different meaning. Every hallway feels different. Even if nothing about the building physically changes, the knowledge of what happened there changes the way people think about it forever. Whenever my dad mentions having been there years earlier, he says it's difficult not to picture the apartment differently now. Memories that once seemed completely normal feel uncomfortable because they're connected to something that hadn't happened yet, but eventually would. There was also extensive media coverage during the investigation. Local newspapers reported on the search for Robert Pogue's remains as investigators worked to locate the garbage bags that had been discarded across the county. Recovering the evidence became an important part of building the case and giving Robert's family answers about what had happened. As more information became public, the full picture slowly emerged. What had first appeared to be a missing persons case became a homicide investigation. Then, investigators uncovered the efforts to conceal the crime. Eventually, prosecutors pieced together enough evidence to explain what had happened inside that apartment. The entire story became one that people in the area never really forgot. Years later, it attracted national attention when it was adapted into an episode of I Killed My Pff. Seeing actors recreate events that had actually happened not far from where people you know lived makes the case feel even more unsettling. For viewers, it's another true crime episode. For people connected to the community, it's something much more personal. Someone always seems to know someone who knew the victim, the investigators, or one of the families involved. Those connections make the story feel much closer than something you simply watch on television. Whenever the case comes up in conversation, the same reaction usually follows. People are shocked that two people who once shared friendships and relationships could end up committing such a brutal crime together. They wonder how betrayal and resentment could escalate into murder instead of simply ending with people walking away from one another. It's impossible to know exactly what was going through their minds that night. What is clear is that one decision after another turned an already tragic situation into something horrifying. A friendship was destroyed. A life was taken. A family lost someone they loved. An apartment became permanently associated with violence. And years later, people are still talking about what happened there. The case serves as a reminder that some of the most disturbing crimes don't happen in abandoned buildings or isolated places. They happen in ordinary homes, ordinary apartments, and ordinary neighborhoods where nothing appears unusual from the outside. That's one of the reasons this story has stayed with me. Every time someone mentions Colby or that apartment, I don't think of the building itself. I think about how quickly ordinary lives can unravel, and how a place that once held everyday memories can become remembered for only one terrible reason. My dad has told me this story so many times over the years, and every time I hear it, it gives me chills. It feels less like a real memory and more like the plot of a slow psychological thriller. Even though I already know how it ends, I still find myself hanging on every word. The strange part is that nothing about it seemed unusual when it happened. It was only years later that all the little details came together in the worst possible way. This happened when my dad was still in school. Like a lot of teenagers, he spent plenty of afternoons at his friends' houses after classes ended. One of his closest friends was a boy I'll call Paul. They lived close enough that it was easy for my dad to walk over after school, do homework together, play outside for a while, and sometimes stay for dinner with Paul's family. Paul's parents were always welcoming. They treated my dad like one of their own, so he was there often enough to know the routines of the house. The dining room overlooked the backyard through a large window, and because the neighboring gardens sat right beside each other, you could clearly see what the people next door were doing outside. One evening, my dad was sitting at the dinner table with Paul and his family. They were eating and talking about the usual everyday things when Paul's father happened to glance out of the window. He casually mentioned that the man next door had decided to build a pond in his backyard. Everyone looked outside. Sure enough, their neighbor was standing in the middle of his lawn with a shovel, digging a large hole. From where my dad sat, he could see the pile of fresh dirt growing beside it. It looked like a lot of work, but there was nothing strange about it. People were always working on their gardens, planting trees, building sheds, or putting in ponds. The adults talked about it for a minute or two. Someone joked that it looked like a bigger pond than anyone really needed. Another person wondered if he planned to keep fish. It was just ordinary dinner conversation, the kind that people completely forget a few hours later. My dad certainly did. A couple of days passed before he went back to Paul's house after school. Everything seemed normal until he happened to look out of the same dining room window again. The hole was gone. Instead of an unfinished pond, there was now a brand new greenhouse sitting exactly where the digging had been taking place. It looked almost as if the pond had never been planned at all. My dad asked Paul what had happened. Paul shrugged and said his neighbor had simply changed his mind. Apparently, he decided he didn't want a pond after all and thought a greenhouse would be more useful. That explanation sounded reasonable enough. People change their plans all the time. Nobody gave it another thought. Around that same period, however, another piece of news quietly spread through the neighborhood. The neighbor's wife had disappeared. People talked about it in low voices. She had been reported missing, but nobody seemed to know exactly what had happened. Some thought she had walked out. Others believed she might have left town. Rumors traveled quickly, but facts were hard to come by. Police made inquiries, but as far as my dad knew, nothing came of it. Life slowly returned to normal. As the months turned into years, people stopped talking about the missing woman altogether. Families moved away. Children grew up. Streets changed. New neighbors arrived. The mystery slowly faded into the background, becoming nothing more than an old local story that people occasionally remembered before moving on to another topic. My dad eventually finished school, became an adult, and started building his own life. Years passed. The neighborhood changed even more. At some point, the house next door to Paul's was sold to a new family. Like many new homeowners, they decided to renovate the property. They wanted to redesign the backyard, replace old features, and give everything a fresh look. That included removing the greenhouse. For them, it was simply another renovation project. For everyone else, it was the beginning of a nightmare. One day my dad was watching the news when a story immediately caught his attention. Human remains had been discovered beneath the greenhouse during the renovation. As investigators continued their work, they identified the body. It was the neighbor's wife, the same woman who had disappeared all those years earlier. She had been buried directly underneath the greenhouse. My dad sat there in complete silence. In an instant, he remembered sitting at Paul's dinner table as a teenager, watching the neighbor digging that enormous hole in the backyard. He remembered Paul's father casually pointing it out during dinner. He remembered seeing the growing pile of dirt through the window. He remembered returning just days later to find a greenhouse standing exactly where the hole had been. At the time, every piece of it had seemed perfectly ordinary. Now every single memory carried a completely different meaning. The hole that everyone assumed was meant for a pond had never become a pond at all. Instead, it had disappeared beneath a greenhouse almost immediately afterward. The timing suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. My dad has often said that what unsettles him most isn't simply that a body was eventually found. It's the realization that he unknowingly witnessed one small piece of the story while it was happening. He wasn't seeing a harmless gardening project after all. He was looking at a scene that would only make sense many years later. Back then, nobody suspected anything. Nobody had any reason to. A man digging in his own backyard wasn't unusual. Building a greenhouse certainly wasn't suspicious. Even hearing that someone had changed their landscaping plans wouldn't make anyone think twice. Everything had an innocent explanation. At least, it seemed that way. Looking back, though, those ordinary details fit together in a way that is impossible to forget. A hole was dug. The planned pond never appeared. A greenhouse suddenly took its place. The neighbor's wife vanished around the same time. Years later, when the greenhouse was finally removed, she was found buried directly beneath it. Whenever my dad tells the story now, he always pauses after describing the hole in the yard. He knows exactly what's coming, but he still lets the silence sit there for a moment before finishing. Somehow that makes it even more unsettling. It's one of those stories that stays with you because there's nothing supernatural about it. There are no ghosts, no strange creatures, and no unexplained events. Every part of it happened in broad daylight, in a quiet neighborhood where life seemed completely normal. That is what makes it so disturbing. An ordinary family ate dinner while looking out of their window. A teenager glanced across the fence without thinking twice. A neighbor appeared to be working on a simple home improvement project. Only years later did anyone realize they had been looking at the beginning of a crime that would remain hidden beneath a greenhouse for years. Even now, whenever my dad reaches the end of the story, he says the same thing. He can still picture that man standing in the backyard with a shovel, calmly digging away while everyone assumed he was building a pond. Knowing what was really hidden beneath that greenhouse is enough to give anyone goosebumps. Back in April, something happened in Bogota, Colombia that has stayed in my mind ever since. It is one of those stories that sounds impossible at first, but it really happened. What makes it even more disturbing is that months later, there are still no clear answers about how it happened or who was responsible. The tragedy involved 4 young people whose lives changed over what should have been a completely ordinary Friday afternoon. 3 girls, all around 13 or 14 years old, met after school at one of their homes. It was the kind of gathering that happens every day around the world. School had ended for the week, the weekend was just beginning, and they wanted to spend some time together. The house belonged to one of the girls, and her older brother happened to be home from college. He was older than the girls, and was simply spending some time at home. Everything about the afternoon sounded normal. The girls decided to bake chocolate chip cookies together. They laughed, talked, and enjoyed themselves while making them. Later, they ordered sushi to be delivered to the house. Along with the sushi came a dessert, chocolate-covered strawberries. It sounds like such an ordinary memory. Friends hanging out, freshly baked cookies, take-out food. A quiet Friday afternoon. There was absolutely nothing about the day that suggested anything was wrong. No one could have imagined that within hours, their lives would be completely destroyed. About 12 hours later, everything changed. One of the girls suddenly became critically ill. She was my husband's cousin's granddaughter, and she was only 13 years old. She was an only child, deeply loved by her parents and family. Her condition deteriorated so quickly that she was rushed to the hospital. Despite the doctor's efforts, she died later that same afternoon. A child who had simply spent the previous evening with her friends was suddenly gone. For her family, the loss was unimaginable. No parent ever expects to lose a child, especially after what appeared to be such an ordinary day. As heartbreaking as that was, the tragedy did not end there. The girl whose house they had gathered in also became seriously ill. She fought for several days, but eventually she passed away as well. 2 young girls had now lost their lives. Meanwhile, the older brother who had been home from college, along with the 3rd friend who had survived the initial illness, were both admitted to the intensive care unit. Their conditions were severe. They remained in the ICU for weeks while doctors tried to save them. For a long time, no one seemed to understand what had happened. Families were desperate for answers. Doctors were searching for a cause. People throughout the community were frightened. At first there was confusion. Was it food poisoning? Was it some kind of contaminated ingredient? Had something gone wrong with the food delivery? Or was it something else entirely? As investigators began looking into the case, an answer finally started to emerge. Authorities announced that the victims had been poisoned by thallium. That revelation shocked many people. Thallium is an extremely toxic heavy metal that has been responsible for numerous poisonings throughout history. Because of its extreme danger, many countries severely restricted or prohibited its use decades ago. Reports stated that it was a substance that had been prohibited since the 1950s. Hearing that made the entire situation even more difficult to understand. How could children in 2020's Colombia somehow be exposed to something so rare and so dangerous? Where had it come from? How did it get into their bodies? Was it in the food, the cookies, the sushi, the chocolate-covered strawberries? Or was it introduced some other way entirely? Those questions remain unanswered. Even after authorities identified the poison, the mystery surrounding the case seemed only to deepen. As far as I know, no official explanation has ever been released describing exactly how the poisoning occurred. There have been no clear answers about where the thallium originated. There have been no public explanations identifying who, if anyone, was responsible. There have been no updates that truly explain how an ordinary afternoon between friends ended in such unimaginable tragedy. That uncertainty is what makes the story so unsettling. It wasn't a dangerous neighborhood. It wasn't a high-risk situation. There was no obvious warning. These were simply teenagers spending time together after school. Everything they did was ordinary. They baked cookies. They ordered dinner. They shared dessert. Nothing about those activities should have ended in multiple deaths and weeks of intensive care. It's difficult not to think about how easily anyone could have been in their place. Children gather after school every day. Families order takeout every day. Friends bake together every day. These are the kinds of simple moments people never think twice about. Yet somehow, in this case, one ordinary Friday became the last normal day two families would ever experience. I also can't stop thinking about the parents. One family lost their only child. Another family lost their daughter. The surviving victims and their relatives will probably carry the emotional and physical effects of that day for the rest of their lives. Even if they eventually recovered physically, I can't imagine how difficult it must be to process everything that happened. To wake up expecting a fun weekend with friends, and then suddenly find yourself fighting for your life in an intensive care unit while your friends never come home. Stories like this are frightening because they don't fit into the kinds of dangers people usually prepare for. There was no storm, no violent crime, no obvious accident, just an ordinary gathering that somehow ended in one of the most mysterious poisoning cases I've heard about in recent years. Even now, what stays with me isn't only the tragedy itself, it's the lack of closure. Knowing what the poison was answered only one question. It created many more. How did it get there? Who introduced it? Was it intentional? Was it accidental? Could it happen again? Without those answers, the case continues to leave an unsettling feeling behind. Months have passed, yet the mystery remains. 2 young girls lost their lives. 2 others spent weeks fighting to survive. Families were left grieving. Friends were left traumatized. And despite all that, there still doesn't seem to be a complete public explanation for how a perfectly ordinary Friday afternoon turned into such an unimaginable nightmare. Sometimes the most haunting stories aren't the ones involving ghosts or the supernatural. Sometimes they're the real-life mysteries that never receive satisfying answers. This is one of those stories. To this day, I still haven't seen any meaningful updates explaining exactly how those children were poisoned. The silence surrounding that question is almost as disturbing as the tragedy itself. About 10 years ago, one of my friends died under circumstances that have never really been explained. Even after all this time, none of us know exactly what happened that night, and I don't think I'll ever stop wondering. Out of all the strange and tragic things I've heard over the years, this is the one that stays with me the most, because it happened to someone I actually knew. It wasn't something I watched on the news or read about online. It was one of us. We had all been part of the same friend group for years. Like most groups of friends, we spent weekends together, grabbed drinks, celebrated birthdays, and just enjoyed each other's company. Nothing about that night seemed unusual when it started. A few of the guys went out together to a local bar for some drinks. It wasn't a wild night from what everyone later said. They were just hanging out, talking, laughing, and doing what they had done countless times before. My friend was there with them, and according to everyone who saw him, he seemed perfectly normal. He had been drinking, but not excessively. Nobody described him as stumbling around, slurring his words, or acting out of character. He wasn't causing trouble, getting into arguments, or looking upset. In fact, everyone agreed he seemed to be in a good mood. One thing about him was that he had a habit of quietly leaving without making a big announcement. If he decided he was tired or wanted to head home, he would simply disappear. It wasn't considered strange because he'd done it before. So when someone eventually noticed he wasn't there anymore, nobody panicked. They just assumed he had gone home. Looking back now, that's probably the hardest part to think about. If anyone had known something was wrong, they would have gone looking for him immediately. Someone would have called him. Someone would have searched the streets around the bar. Someone would have made sure he got home safely. But nobody had any reason to believe anything was wrong. To everyone there, it was just another normal night ending the way it always did. The next morning changed everything. Instead of waking up safely in his own bed, my friend was found lying in the middle of a road. It wasn't even a road that made sense. It wasn't on the route he normally would have taken to get home. That detail has always bothered everyone who knew him. Why was he there? How did he get there? Did he walk there? Did someone take him there? Did he become confused? Did something happen after he left the bar? Nobody has ever been able to answer those questions. Sometime during the early morning hours, a truck struck him. By the time he was found, it was already far too late. The autopsy concluded that the injuries from being hit by the truck were fatal, assuming he had still been alive at the moment of impact. That wording has haunted me for years. Assuming he was alive. Because that's the problem. Nobody actually knows. If someone had attacked him before he ended up on that road, if he had been assaulted, if he had suffered any injuries before the truck hit him, there would have been almost no way to prove it afterward. The damage caused by the collision was so catastrophic that any earlier injuries could easily have been hidden forever. That possibility has never left my mind. Not because I know something happened, but because nobody knows that it didn't. The investigation never produced any clear answers. No witnesses came forward saying they saw him leave. No taxi driver remembered picking him up. No other customers from the bar recalled seeing which direction he went. It's as though he simply disappeared from the bar and reappeared hours later in the middle of a road where he had absolutely no reason to be. That gap in time remains completely empty. An entire part of his final night has simply never been explained. I've replayed the possibilities in my head more times than I can count. Maybe he decided to take a walk for some reason. Maybe he became disoriented. Maybe he accepted a ride from someone. Maybe someone offered to help him and instead took him somewhere else. Maybe he witnessed something he shouldn't have. Maybe nothing criminal happened at all. Or maybe something terrible happened that nobody was ever able to uncover. The truth is that every theory eventually falls apart because there simply isn't enough information. That's what makes it so difficult. Not knowing is sometimes worse than knowing. If there had been an explanation, even a painful one, maybe we could have accepted it. Instead, all we have are questions. When someone dies from illness, or even from an accident with a clear cause, painful as it is, there's at least a story that makes sense. With him, there isn't. His final hours are just missing. Whenever our old group gets together, his name eventually comes up. Someone always remembers one of his jokes. Someone remembers a trip we all took together. Someone remembers something funny he said years ago. For a little while, we're smiling again. Then someone mentions that night. The conversation always slows down. Nobody has any new answers. Nobody ever does. The silence says everything. I've often thought about how ordinary that evening probably felt to him. He went out with friends, shared a few drinks, talked, laughed. Then, at some point, he left. None of us realized those would be the final moments anyone we knew would ever spend with him. There was no goodbye, no warning, no feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Just an ordinary evening that somehow turned into an unsolved tragedy. Sometimes I wonder if his family has found any peace over the years. I honestly hope they have. Living with unanswered questions has to be unimaginably difficult. Every anniversary must bring those same thoughts back. Every new piece of information probably raises another question instead of providing an answer. As friends, we've had to learn to live with that uncertainty too. Even now, over a decade later, I occasionally catch myself thinking about him when I'm driving late at night. If I pass a quiet road with no cars around, I remember his story. I think about how quickly life can change. One moment you're laughing with friends at a bar. A few hours later, nobody knows where you are. Then suddenly, you're gone, forever. What makes this story especially unsettling isn't just the tragedy itself. It's the missing pieces. It's the empty timeline that no one has ever been able to fill in. It's knowing that somewhere between leaving that bar and being found on that road, something happened. Whether it was an accident, a terrible coincidence, or something much darker, nobody knows. Maybe nobody ever will. After all these years, the mystery remains exactly where it started. Every theory is only a guess. Every explanation has holes. The truth disappeared with him that night. I still miss him. I miss seeing him at gatherings. I miss hearing people laugh at the things he'd say. I miss knowing he was just another member of our group who would quietly head home without anyone thinking twice about it. Now, every time someone leaves early without saying goodbye, I find myself checking later to make sure they got home safely. It's a habit I never used to have. Maybe it's irrational. Maybe it's just grief that never completely faded. But losing someone in a way that makes no sense changes the way you look at ordinary moments. It reminds you that life doesn't always provide closure. Sometimes all that's left behind are memories, unanswered questions, and the hope that wherever our friend is now, he finally knows the answers that the rest of us never will. My parents were going through a bitter divorce when I was around 9 or 10 years old. The atmosphere inside our home was constantly tense. There were arguments almost every day, and it felt like everyone in the house was living under a cloud. Looking back, I know that kind of environment can affect how children experience the world. But there are two things that happened during that time that I still cannot explain. Even now, decades later, they give me chills. My father had worked in information technology since the early 1980s, so I grew up around computers. Because of him, I knew much more about technology than most kids my age. Our house was brand new, 4 stories tall, and built in Switzerland. It was solid concrete with thick insulated walls, not the kind of house where you could easily hear noises traveling from room to room. My dad had an office in the basement. Since he was gone all day and usually didn't get home until after 5 in the evening, the office was almost always empty. It eventually became my little kingdom. I spent hours experimenting on the computer, exploring the strange corners of the early internet, and browsing the kinds of bizarre websites that fascinated curious kids in the 1990s. One afternoon, I was sitting alone in that basement office. The room had no windows because it was completely underground. The computer wasn't playing any music. No videos were open. The speakers were silent. I was completely focused on the screen. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, something growled directly beside my right ear. Not somewhere across the room. Not through the computer speakers. Right next to my head. The sound is almost impossible to describe. It was a deep, guttural growl mixed with what sounded like a quiet, mocking laugh. It wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. It was loud enough that I physically felt the vibration against my skull. Even stranger, I felt a slight movement of air against my ear, almost like someone had leaned over and whispered directly beside me. That detail has always stayed with me. The reason it frightened me so much is because I'm completely deaf in my right ear. I cannot hear anything from that side. Yet somehow I experienced the vibration and sensation as though something had been inches away from me. There were no windows open. No one else was in the basement. The walls were thick enough that outside noise barely existed. I knew exactly what the computer speakers sounded like, and this wasn't coming from them. My body reacted before my brain even had time to process what had happened. I ran. I've never moved that fast before, or since. If there was ever a day I could have outrun an Olympic sprinter, it was that one. It took months before I could bring myself to spend any real time in that basement again. Even then, I was never comfortable. I constantly looked over my shoulder. I never became fully absorbed in whatever I was doing, because part of me was always waiting for something else to happen. As strange as that experience was, it wasn't the only unsettling thing happening in the house. The nannies who worked for our family occasionally mentioned seeing things they couldn't explain. Then, my younger brother had an experience of his own. He was about 6 years old at the time. One day he came running downstairs from the 4th floor, completely hysterical. He was crying so hard he could barely speak. Eventually, he managed to tell us that he had seen a tall black figure walk into one of the small storage rooms where we kept our toys. The entire 4th floor was basically our playroom. There were 2 tiny storage closets built into opposite sides of the room. They weren't connected to anything. They simply held toys. There was nowhere for anyone to disappear. Yet my brother insisted he had watched someone walk inside. When adults checked the closets, they were empty. We all assumed he had imagined it. But he refused to go upstairs alone for a long time afterward. Then came the second event. Unlike the first one, this wasn't something only I experienced. My brother and I were sharing a bedroom. One night, in the middle of our sleep, we were both suddenly awakened by the sound of a small bell ringing. The sound was crystal clear, not loud, just distinct. It seemed to come from somewhere near the middle of the room. At first, we didn't think much of it. We assumed one of our toys must have made the noise. Children's toys sometimes make strange sounds when batteries begin dying. We went back to sleep. The following night, it happened again. Exactly the same sound. Again, both of us woke up instantly. Night after night, the bell continued, always at roughly the same time. What made it even stranger was how we both woke immediately before, or as it rang, as if something had alerted us. Eventually, we told our mother. She didn't believe us. Then one night, she stayed in the room with us. She heard it too. So did our grandmother. Everyone searched the room. Every toy was checked. Eventually, everything was removed. The furniture, the toys, anything that could possibly produce a sound. The room was reduced to almost nothing except our 2 mattresses. Still, every night, the bell rang. Always from the same general area. Always waking us instantly. No one ever found an explanation. My grandmother was an extremely religious woman. After weeks turned into months, she began praying with us every evening before bedtime. Eventually, the nightly bell stopped. Life slowly returned to normal. Then, after my parents finalized their divorce, we moved. Our new home was nearly 200 kilometers away, a completely different town, a completely different building. For a while, nothing happened. Then one night, the bell returned, the exact same sound. Again, it woke both of us. Again, there was no obvious source. My grandmother once more began praying every night. After some time, the ringing disappeared. This time, it never came back. Over the years, I've tried to explain everything logically. I've considered hidden electronics, faulty toys, pipes, neighbors, outside noises, practical jokes. I've gone through every explanation I could think of. The basement growl could have had a natural cause I never identified. The bell could have been something completely ordinary that no one ever discovered. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that every person involved experienced those moments differently, and decades later I still remember the fear as vividly as if it happened yesterday. Whether there was a rational explanation or not almost doesn't matter anymore. Those experiences became part of one of the darkest periods of my childhood. Whenever I think back to that house, I don't just remember the divorce or the arguments. I remember the basement. I remember that impossible growl beside my ear. And I remember waking night after night to the sound of a bell that no one could ever find. For years, I worked at a pharmacy, and there was one customer that every employee dreaded seeing walk through the front door. He was an older man, and without exaggeration, he was one of the rudest people I have ever met. Nothing was ever good enough for him. Every visit seemed to end with him arguing, complaining, or treating the staff with complete disrespect. It did not matter who was helping him. Pharmacists, technicians, cashiers, everyone eventually had their own unpleasant story about dealing with him. Over time, we all learned to recognize him the moment he walked in. He regularly picked up extremely large prescriptions for Tylenol #3, a medication containing codeine that requires strict prescribing and dispensing regulations. He would also buy multiple tubes of a prescription topical cream containing lidocaine or a similar anesthetic. None of that seemed especially unusual on its own. It was his behavior that made everyone uncomfortable. One incident has always stayed with me. His doctor prescribed a medication that was so uncommon almost no pharmacy kept it in stock. After checking our inventory, we discovered that another pharmacy across town had the medication available. It was already around 7:30 that evening, and our next medication shipment had already been finalized, so there was no guarantee we could have it by the following day. We were honestly trying to help him. Someone called to explain the situation and asked whether he would prefer picking it up at the other location rather than waiting. Instead of appreciating the effort, he completely lost his temper. He started yelling at the staff. He made threats. Then he began taking photographs of the pharmacist's professional licenses that were displayed on the wall. The entire situation became incredibly uncomfortable. Our store manager was usually supportive and handled difficult customers well. The assistant manager, unfortunately, was the exact opposite. When someone suggested calling the police because of the threats, we were basically told that if we made that decision, we would be dealing with the consequences ourselves. Needless to say, none of us felt particularly protected. The strange thing was that his wife was nothing like him. Whenever she came into the pharmacy, she was polite, patient, and genuinely kind. She would smile, thank us for helping her, and never caused any problems. It was difficult to understand how two people with such completely different personalities could be together. At some point, we learned that the man had once worked in law enforcement. Some people said he had been a police officer. Others believed he had worked with the DEA or another federal agency because of comments he occasionally made. I never knew exactly what his background was, but it always added another layer to the mystery surrounding him. Eventually, I left that pharmacy and moved on to another job. Several years passed. One day, I happened to meet someone who still worked there. We started reminiscing about old coworkers and the unforgettable customers everyone remembered. Naturally, his name came up. I expected another story about him yelling at employees or causing a scene. Instead, I heard something that completely shocked me. He had murdered his wife before taking his own life. I just stood there in disbelief. As unpleasant as he had always been, I never imagined he was capable of something so horrific. The news completely changed the way I looked back on every interaction I'd ever had with him. What makes it even more unsettling is where this all happened. The area is incredibly quiet and safe. It's the kind of neighborhood where people comfortably walk their dogs at 1 o'clock in the morning without thinking twice. Violent crime is rare enough that something like this becomes the kind of story people remember for years. Looking back now, I realize I always felt uneasy around him. There was something about him that made everyone tense whenever he came into the pharmacy. Maybe it was just his constant anger. Maybe it was the way he treated people. Whatever it was, something always felt off. But the person I think about most isn't him. It's his wife. She was always kind to us. She never raised her voice. She treated everyone with respect, even after the way her husband behaved. She deserved a long, peaceful life. Instead, she became the victim of someone she trusted most. That realization is what still stays with me. Sometimes the people who seem the loudest and angriest in public are carrying something much darker behind closed doors. And sometimes the kindest person in the room is the one quietly living with a reality no one else can see. For years, I worked at a pharmacy, and during that time there was one customer none of us ever forgot. He wasn't memorable because he was friendly. Quite the opposite. He was, without question, one of the rudest people I have ever dealt with. Every visit seemed to end in an argument. He treated the staff terribly, no matter who happened to be helping him that day. Nothing was ever good enough. If there was even the smallest inconvenience, he would immediately become hostile. Over time, everyone at the pharmacy came to recognize him the moment he walked through the door. He regularly picked up very large prescriptions, including Tylenol #3, which contains codeine and is a tightly controlled medication. He also routinely purchased multiple tubes of a prescription topical cream containing lidocaine or similar ingredients. None of that seemed especially unusual on its own. It was his behavior that stood out. One incident has always stayed with me. His doctor had prescribed a medication that almost no pharmacy kept in stock because it was so rarely used. We checked everywhere we could. The only location that had it was another pharmacy across town. It was already around 7:30 in the evening, and our medication order for the day had already been processed, meaning there was no guarantee we'd receive it by the next morning. Trying to help, we attempted to contact him. We simply wanted to ask whether he'd prefer picking it up at the other pharmacy instead of waiting. Most people would appreciate having the option. He exploded. He started yelling, making threats, and acting aggressively toward the staff. At one point, he even began taking photographs of our professional licenses that were displayed on the wall. It was incredibly unsettling. Our store manager usually handled situations like that well and tried to support the staff. Unfortunately, the assistant manager wasn't nearly as helpful. When people suggested calling the police because of his behavior, we were basically told that if we did, we'd be dealing with the consequences ourselves. That didn't exactly make anyone feel protected. Oddly enough, his wife was completely different. Whenever she came in, she was polite, calm, and easy to talk to. She always seemed kind. It was hard to understand how two people who appeared so different could be together. At some point, we learned that the man had previously worked in law enforcement. Some people said he had been a police officer. Others believed he may have worked with the DIA or another federal agency. I never knew exactly what was true, but it explained why he sometimes made comments suggesting he had experience in that world. Eventually, I left that pharmacy and moved on. Years passed. One day I ran into someone who still worked there. We started catching up, talking about old co-workers and the customers everyone remembered. Then, they mentioned him. At first I figured they were just going to tell me another story about him causing problems. Instead, they told me something I never expected. He had shot and killed his wife before taking his own life. I was stunned. It felt impossible to connect that horrifying news with the difficult customer I remembered. Yes, he had always been angry. Yes, he had been intimidating. But hearing that he was capable of something so devastating was still incredibly shocking. What made it even harder to process was where all of this happened. The community was known for being quiet and safe. It was the kind of neighborhood where people walked their dogs late at night without giving it a second thought. Violent crime was extremely uncommon. That news completely changed the way I remembered him. Looking back, I realized I had always felt uneasy around him, even if I couldn't explain exactly why. But the person I kept thinking about wasn't him. It was his wife. She had always been kind to us. She smiled. She treated everyone with respect. She never deserved what happened to her. Sometimes you meet people who leave you with a bad feeling, and later you learn they were carrying far more darkness than anyone around them ever realized. It's a reminder that the brief interactions we have with strangers rarely tell the whole story. You may never truly know what someone is capable of, or what someone else is quietly enduring behind closed doors. I still remember one night from my college years that managed to scare me more than almost anything else, even though nothing supernatural actually happened. This was back in the early 1990s. The internet wasn't really a thing yet, so entertainment was pretty simple. Most nights, if I wasn't out with friends, I'd stay home with a good book. At the time, I was renting the ground floor of a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It had a cozy little kitchen, a living room, one bedroom, and a bathroom. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was comfortable. It was early fall, one of those evenings where the weather is cool enough that you can leave every window open and enjoy the breeze drifting through the apartment. That night, I climbed into bed with one of my favorite novels, Stephen King's Pet Sematary. I'd already read it 5 or 6 times, so there weren't any surprises left. I knew every major scene, every twist, and every frightening moment by heart. Reading it again felt more familiar than scary. Outside, everything was perfectly still. No traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I don't even remember which chapter I was reading when it happened. Without the slightest warning, the silence exploded. A scream ripped through the night. It was unbelievably loud. The sound was so horrifying that my entire body locked up instantly. It sounded exactly like a baby, or maybe a very young child, screaming in absolute terror. Not crying, not throwing a tantrum. It sounded like someone had just been horribly hurt. I've never heard another sound quite like it. The strangest part wasn't just the scream itself. It was what happened to me physically. I didn't jump. I didn't sit up. I didn't even move. Instead, it felt like an intense wave of heat washed over my entire body all at once. Every muscle froze. I just lay there, completely still, staring into the darkness. I waited. Anyone who has ever heard a child cry knows what usually comes next. There's the first scream, a brief pause to catch a breath. Then the crying starts. I kept waiting for that second sound. It never came. There was nothing. The entire neighborhood fell silent again. Not a single voice, not another scream. No footsteps, no doors opening. Nothing. The silence somehow felt even worse than the scream. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, I finally forced myself out of bed. Very carefully, I walked over to the window. The street outside was illuminated by several streetlights, making it easy enough to see. I looked up and down the road. Nothing, no people, no cars, no one running, no sign that anything unusual had happened. Everything looked completely normal. I stood there trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Then, almost as suddenly as the scream itself, I remembered something. The family across the street owned an incredibly grumpy cat. It was notorious around the neighborhood. Whenever another cat wandered into its territory, the two would have these unbelievably loud territorial fights. If you've never heard cats screaming at each other in the middle of the night, it can sound shockingly human, especially if you're not expecting it. Especially if you're lying in bed, reading one of the most unsettling horror novels ever written. The sound I had heard wasn't a child at all. It had almost certainly been that cat. Realizing that should have made me feel better. Instead, I just laughed nervously. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. There I was, completely absorbed in Pet Sematary, already surrounded by the eerie atmosphere of the story, when one of the most terrifying sounds I'd ever heard echoed through the open windows. Even after figuring out what had most likely caused it, the experience stuck with me. In fact, I don't think I've ever read Pet Sematary again after that night. Maybe it was just an unfortunate coincidence. Maybe my imagination filled in the gaps because I was already immersed in a horror novel. Either way, every time I think about that scream, I can still remember the feeling that washed over me in that quiet apartment. The sudden heat, the complete silence that followed, and those long seconds where I genuinely believed something terrible had happened just outside my window. Sometimes the most memorable scares don't come from ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're nothing more than perfect timing, an overactive imagination, and one very angry cat. I have witnessed two incidents in my life that I know I will never completely forget. Neither one involved anything supernatural. They were simply moments where ordinary days turned into unimaginable tragedies in the span of a few seconds. The first happened while I was working on a construction site. Like many job sites, there was a stray black cat that had practically become part of the crew. Most of the workers liked having it around. Every day, someone would toss it scraps of food during breaks, and over time it became comfortable wandering around the site. It would casually weave between equipment, sit near people eating lunch, or disappear for hours before showing up again looking for another free meal. There was only one worker who absolutely hated the cat. Every time he saw it, he would yell at it, chase it away, or pretend to kick at it. Sometimes he actually tried to make contact, although the cat was usually quick enough to dart out of reach. Everyone else mostly ignored it. We figured the cat would eventually learn to stay away from him. One afternoon, that same worker was feeding pieces of scrap wood into a massive industrial wood chipper. The machine was incredibly loud. Even standing several yards away, you had to raise your voice just to hold a conversation. The cat quietly wandered up behind him. Maybe it wanted food. Maybe it was simply passing through. No one will ever know. Suddenly, the cat reached out and scratched the back of his leg. It was probably nothing more than a quick swipe. But it startled him. In one instant, he jerked violently in surprise. He lost his balance. Before anyone could react, he fell toward the machine. People immediately started screaming. Someone rushed to hit the emergency stop. The machine shut down quickly, just not quickly enough. The injuries were catastrophic. Half of his body had already been pulled into the machine. There was nothing anyone could do. He died within minutes from the massive blood loss. As horrifying as it was, there was at least one small mercy. He did not appear to suffer for very long. Even after all these years, though, I still remember the expression on his face in those final moments. It is one of those images that never completely leaves you. The second incident happened much earlier in my life. I was around 8 or 9 years old. My friends and I were outside our apartment building, doing what kids usually do. Running around, playing games, talking about nothing important. It was an ordinary afternoon. Without warning, something caught my attention above us. At first, I couldn't even understand what I was seeing. Something was falling. Then I realized it was a person. An elderly man had jumped from a 6th-floor apartment. For a split second, everything seemed strangely quiet. Then, he hit the ground. The sound is something I can still remember all these years later. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It echoed through the courtyard and instantly froze everyone nearby. The man landed face down. The impact had been so violent that it left a noticeable indentation in the dirt beneath him. For a few moments, he was still moving. His body twitched. There were faint sounds that I later realized were his final attempts to breathe. Then, nothing. Everything became still. Adults began shouting. Someone called emergency services. Within minutes, police officers and paramedics arrived. By then, there was nothing they could do except secure the area and confirm what everyone already feared. As children, none of us really understood what we had just witnessed. We didn't have the words for trauma. We didn't know how something like that could affect a person. We simply went home in silence. But years later, I realized that every one of us remembered that day. The details stayed with us. The sound, the confusion, the shock of seeing something no child should ever witness. People often think the memories that haunt you are always dramatic or cinematic. In reality, they are usually the smallest details. A face you cannot forget. A sound that suddenly comes back years later. The strange silence after everything is over. Those are the parts that stay with you. They become memories you never asked to keep, yet somehow carry with you for the rest of your life. A few years ago, I was staying at my friend George's house for a week. Like a lot of teenagers, we thought it would be fun to sneak out at night. We waited until everyone in the house was asleep, grabbed our electric bikes, and quietly slipped outside without anyone noticing. At first, it felt like an adventure. We rode around the neighborhood for a while before heading over to the local high school, where a few other kids had also gathered. We hung out there for a couple of hours, talking, joking around, and enjoying the freedom that only comes from being out long after you're supposed to be asleep. Eventually, though, reality caught up with us. Both of our bike batteries had died much faster than we expected. That meant we had to walk all the way back to George's house. Normally, it wouldn't have been a big deal, but there was one problem. George's dad had to leave for work at 6 o'clock that morning, and it was already close to 5. If he woke up and found us gone, we'd be in serious trouble. The quickest route home was through a narrow alleyway. During the daytime, people walked through it all the time. It wasn't considered dangerous, but neither of us had ever gone through it before sunrise. Still, we didn't think we had much of a choice. We started walking. The streets of South Philly were unusually quiet. Now, quiet streets at 5 in the morning aren't that strange. But this felt different. There were no passing cars, no headlights, no people walking dogs, no birds, no distant conversations. Nothing. It was like the entire neighborhood had simply stopped existing. The silence was almost impossible to ignore. As we entered the alley, something happened that I still can't explain. A strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't fear at first. It was physical. The best way I can describe it is that my head started tingling. Every instinct in my body suddenly felt like it had switched on at once. I looked over at George. Before I could even ask anything, I could tell by his face that something was wrong. "You feel that too?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. Yeah, that was all either of us needed to hear. Without another word, we started running. Not jogging, not speed walking. Running as fast as we possibly could. Neither of us saw anyone. Nothing jumped out. Nothing chased us. But every instinct we had was screaming the same message. Get out. I've been scared before. I've watched horror movies. I've walked through sketchy neighborhoods. I've been startled plenty of times. This wasn't like any of those experiences. It felt deeper. It was the kind of fear that doesn't come from seeing something. It comes from feeling that something is terribly, terribly wrong. Some people call it a gut instinct. Others call it intuition. Whatever it was, both of us felt it at exactly the same time. We made it back to George's house without stopping. Neither of us really talked about what had happened. We just knew we never wanted to feel that again. The strange part is what happened the next day. Against our better judgment, we snuck out again. This time, we didn't bother bringing the bikes because we'd forgotten to charge them. Eventually, we found ourselves standing near the entrance to that same alley. We looked at each other. Neither of us wanted to go through it. But taking another route would have added several extra minutes to the walk, and we figured maybe we just let our imaginations get the better of us the night before. So, we went in. Everything looked normal at first. Then, we passed a house near the alley. It wasn't directly inside the alley itself, but it was close enough that anyone walking through couldn't miss it. One of the windows was visible from where we were standing. I happened to glance inside. For a second, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. Then it clicked. There was blood. A lot of blood. It was splattered across the walls. There were stains stretching through the hallway inside the house. It looked like something unimaginably violent had happened. I froze. George looked through the window too. The moment he saw it, we both turned and ran. As soon as we got somewhere safe, we called the police. Within what felt like minutes, patrol cars started arriving. Then more. Soon the entire area was blocked off. Yellow crime scene tape surrounded the property. Detectives arrived. Investigators carrying equipment went inside. People wearing protective suits began entering the house. I remember seeing uniforms with different agency letters on them, though I was too overwhelmed to notice exactly what they said. Before long, the entire neighborhood seemed to be watching from behind the police tape. Standing there, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. I have no idea whether the two events were connected. Maybe whatever happened inside that house had already occurred before we walked through the alley. Maybe it happened later. Maybe our instincts reacting the night before were nothing more than an eerie coincidence. I'll probably never know. But I've never forgotten that feeling. People often say to trust your instincts. Most of the time, that advice probably seems overly cautious. After that experience, though, I understood why people say it. Sometimes your brain notices something long before you consciously understand it. And whether what we felt that morning was coincidence, subconscious awareness, or something impossible to explain, it was enough to make two teenage boys run without ever looking back. I have experienced something a few times in my life that still unsettles me whenever I think about it. The best way I can describe it is that I would suddenly go completely dark. One moment, I would be fully aware of what I was doing. The next moment, everything would disappear. Then I would suddenly become aware again, but at a completely different point in time, with no memory of anything that had happened in between. It has not happened in years, thankfully, but there are two experiences that I have never forgotten. The most recent one happened while I was asleep. I remember waking up and finding myself standing at the top of the stairs. I had no idea how I got there. For a couple of seconds, I just stood there, staring down the staircase, completely confused, trying to understand what was happening. Then I heard my father's voice behind me. He calmly said my name. The sound scared me so badly that I nearly jumped out of my skin. When I turned around, I realized he was standing right behind me, holding on to me and preventing me from going downstairs. I had no idea why. Later, my parents told me what had happened. Apparently, my mother had come into my room to check on me while I was sleeping. Instead of waking up normally, I suddenly began screaming. I fought against her, scratched her while trying to get away, and then ran toward the stairs before my father caught me. I have absolutely no memory of any of it. If that had been the only time something like this happened, I probably would have assumed it was an unusual episode of sleepwalking or some kind of night terror. But it was not the first time. Something similar had happened years earlier when I was in elementary school. One morning, I got ready for school as usual. I was tired and accidentally forgot to change out of my pajama shirt before leaving the house. I remember walking toward the entrance of the school. I was just about to step inside when everything suddenly went black, not like falling asleep, not like blinking. It was as if someone had simply erased time. There was no sound, no dreams, no thoughts. Nothing then, just as suddenly, I became aware again. Except now I was walking out of the school building at the end of the day. School was over. Students were leaving. Everyone else acted as though it had been a completely ordinary day. For me, the entire school day had simply vanished. I had absolutely no memory of attending classes, talking to anyone, eating lunch, or doing any schoolwork. It felt as though I had stepped into the building 1 second and stepped back outside the very next. The strangest part is that this was not unusual for me back then. It had happened multiple times throughout my childhood. I would lose hours of time without realizing it. Then I would suddenly become aware again somewhere else, at a different time of day, with no memory of how I had gotten there. As a child, I accepted it as normal because I did not know any different. Looking back now, I realize how strange it really was. One feeling from my early childhood has stayed with me more than anything else. For years, I often felt less like I was living my own life, and more like I was watching it. It was almost as if I were a passenger sitting quietly inside my own body, while someone else made the decisions. I was there. I could observe everything, but I did not always feel like I was the one in control. Eventually, those episodes stopped happening. I have not experienced anything like them in years. Even so, every now and then I think back to those missing moments and wonder what really happened during the hours I cannot remember. Maybe there is a perfectly ordinary medical explanation. Maybe there is something my mind was doing that I simply did not understand at the time. Whatever the reason, those blank spaces in my memory remain some of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. I rewrote it in the same style you requested. Simple English, smooth flow, no headings inside the story, and keeping the original meaning and emotional tone. There are some stories you hear when you are young that never really leave your mind. They stay with you for years because they are so disturbing and because they involve people who were connected to your own life, even if only indirectly. One of those stories came from my sister. She had a friend who was expecting her first child. She was excited and preparing for the baby, just like any soon-to-be mother would be. She was getting ready for a completely new chapter in her life. At some point, she went online looking for inexpensive baby clothes. She was trying to find affordable things for her newborn, and apparently used Craigslist to connect with someone selling items. What was supposed to be a simple exchange turned into something horrifying. The woman she met was not there just to sell baby clothes. According to what we heard, the situation ended with the pregnant mother being attacked and the baby being taken from her in a violent act that resulted in both of their deaths. Even years later, it is hard to understand how something like that could happen. Someone was preparing to bring a child into the world. She was probably thinking about names, clothes, the future, and all the little things parents think about before their baby arrives. Instead, a simple attempt to find affordable clothing became the reason her life was taken from her. What makes stories like that even more frightening is how normal the beginning sounds. There was nothing unusual about looking for baby items. There was nothing strange about meeting someone to buy something secondhand. It was something countless people do every day. That is what makes it so unsettling. A normal decision led someone into a situation they never could have imagined. Another story that has stayed with me involves my childhood babysitter. She was only 18 years old when she was murdered. I was too young at the time to fully understand the situation, but I still remember her. Even as a child, I noticed that she was a very beautiful and kind young woman. I didn't understand things like attraction or appearance the way older people do, but I remember that she stood out to me. She was someone I looked up to, and someone whose memory stayed with me. The details of what happened are heartbreaking. She was with two men who accused her of stealing a camera. They confronted her over it, and the situation turned violent. She was shot in the head at close range with a shotgun. Later, the camera they accused her of stealing was found inside their van. She had been blamed for something she didn't do, and she lost her life because of it. Thinking about that has always been incredibly sad. She was only 18 years old. She had her entire life ahead of her. She should have been making memories, building relationships, and figuring out who she wanted to become. Instead, her life ended over a false accusation. I often think about her parents and what they must have gone through. Losing a child is already an unimaginable pain, but losing them in such a sudden and violent way is something no parent should ever have to experience. These are the kinds of stories that stay with you, because they remind you how fragile life can be. Both of these women were just living their lives. One was preparing to become a mother. The other was a young woman who was simply spending time with people she trusted. Neither of them expected that ordinary moments would become the final moments of their lives. Years can pass, but memories like these don't disappear. They stay because they represent real people, real families, and real lives that were taken away far too soon. I will never forget those stories, and I will always feel sadness for the people who lost them. I can also make future rewrites longer and more detailed by expanding the atmosphere, emotions, and timeline while keeping the original events unchanged. My high school psychologist was one of those people who left a lasting impact on everyone who met him. Years after graduating, I still remembered the difference he made in my life and the way he helped so many students who were struggling. He wasn't just someone who worked at a school. He was someone who genuinely cared about the people who came to him for help. That is why hearing what happened was so difficult to process. Not long ago, I found out that he had been murdered by his own wife. The case happened in a small town where serious crime was extremely rare. It was the kind of place where people felt safe, where neighbors knew each other, and where something this horrific was almost impossible to imagine happening. According to reports, his wife killed him, their 2 children, and then took her own life. Their youngest child, a toddler, was left alive. That detail is the part that is hardest to understand. How could something like that happen? How could a mother make the decision to take the lives of her own children, yet leave one child behind to live with the aftermath? That child will have to grow up carrying something no child should ever have to experience. They will eventually learn what happened, learn that their family is gone, and have to live with questions that may never have answers. The thought of that kind of trauma is heartbreaking. Before this happened, my psychologist had been dealing with a serious illness. He had brain cancer, and his wife had been documenting his condition and his journey on TikTok. From the outside, it looked like she was sharing updates about his health and the challenges they were facing as a family. Knowing that makes the situation even more complicated. I can understand that someone watching a loved one suffer through a terrible illness might experience overwhelming emotions. Fear, exhaustion, grief, and hopelessness can affect people in ways that are difficult to imagine. I can even understand how someone might convince themselves that they are ending suffering or that they are making a choice out of what they believe is love. But there is still a line that cannot be crossed. Whatever pain or fear she was experiencing, killing her husband was not something she had the right to decide. He was a person who deserved the chance to continue living his life and making his own choices. And when it came to the children, it becomes even harder to comprehend. They were innocent. They had no choice in any of it. They deserved the chance to grow up, experience life, and become their own people. The fact that one child survived makes the situation even more devastating. That child will have to grow up knowing that something terrible happened to their family and wondering why they were the one left behind. There are no easy answers to something like this. What makes it hurt even more is knowing the kind of person my psychologist was. He spent years helping teenagers through some of the hardest moments of their lives. He listened to people when they felt like nobody else understood them. He gave support to kids who were struggling and helped them find their way through difficult situations. So many people were better because he was there. It feels especially cruel that someone who dedicated his life to helping others had his own life taken away in such a tragic way. The news didn't just affect people who knew him personally. It affected everyone who had been helped by him, including former students like me who still remembered his kindness years later. It is strange how someone can be part of your life for a short period of time, but still leave an impact that lasts forever. I will always remember him as the person who helped me when I needed it. That is the person he was. Not the victim of a horrible crime, not just a name in a news story. He was someone who mattered to many people. And that is why this tragedy feels so painful. A man who spent his life protecting and supporting children lost his own life. His family was destroyed, and a child was left behind to carry the weight of something unimaginable. Some tragedies are difficult to even put into words. This is one of them. My brother was in 10th grade when something happened that completely changed the way our family looked at the people around us. It was the kind of thing that sounds impossible when you hear it, like something written for a crime documentary. But it actually happened. My brother was spending the night at a friend's house with a group of close friends. They were just normal teenagers doing what teenagers do. They were hanging out, talking, joking around, and enjoying a sleepover. Nothing about that night seemed different from any other night they had spent together. One of the boys there was someone they all considered a friend. He was part of their group, someone they trusted, someone they never imagined could do anything horrible. At some point during the night, he said he needed to leave for a little while because he had something to take care of. Nobody thought much of it. Friends leave sleepovers all the time. Someone might go home to grab something, run an errand, or handle a personal matter. But this time, he wasn't leaving for something ordinary. He went back to his own house and murdered his entire family. His younger brothers were killed too. They were still in middle school, and my sister had been close with them. They weren't just names in a news report to us. They were real people our family knew. They were kids who had laughed, talked, and spent time with people we cared about, while everyone at the sleepover had no idea what was happening. An unimaginable tragedy was taking place somewhere else. The most disturbing part came afterward. After killing his family, he returned to the sleepover house. He acted like nothing had happened. The same person who had just committed an unthinkable crime walked back in and continued being around his friends as if it was a normal night. The others had no idea what he had done. They were still sitting there with someone they thought they knew. That is the part that has always been difficult to understand. How could someone do something so terrible and then simply walk back into a room full of people and pretend everything was fine? The next day, things became even more horrifying. He planned to have a party at his house that night. His family was still inside. The bodies had not been discovered yet, and people were apparently expected to show up and spend time in that same house without knowing what had happened there. Thankfully, somehow the police became aware that something was wrong before the party could happen. They intervened and stopped it. When officers entered the house, they discovered the truth. The house that was supposed to be the location of a teenage party was actually the scene of a terrible crime. Everything changed in that moment. A place that should have been a home full of family memories had become a crime scene. For our family, the story was especially painful because of the connection we had to the younger boys. Knowing that my sister was close with them made it feel much more personal. They weren't strangers. They were kids who had people who cared about them and who never deserved what happened. Years afterward, something else happened that still bothers us. While he was in jail, the person responsible would call my brother on our home phone. This went on for years. The calls would come through our landline, and every time the phone rang, there was always that feeling of knowing who might be on the other end. It became something our family associated with fear and discomfort. Imagine sitting at the dinner table with your family, trying to have a normal meal, while knowing that the person who destroyed another family could suddenly be calling your house. The sound of that phone ringing became something we never forgot. Eventually, my brother stopped answering. He couldn't keep putting himself through it. There was no reason to continue having those conversations with someone who had done something so horrific. But those years of calls stayed with us. It's strange how certain sounds or moments can become connected to painful memories. For some people, it's a place they can never walk into again. For us, it was the phone ringing during dinner and knowing exactly who might be calling. Looking back, the thing that still haunts me most is how normal everything seemed before the truth came out. A group of teenagers were just hanging out at a sleepover. They trusted someone sitting right beside them. They had no idea that while they were laughing and spending time together, something terrible had already happened. The person they knew as a friend had a secret that none of them could have imagined. It is terrifying to think about how someone can appear completely normal while hiding something so dark. The person who came back to that sleepover was the same person their friends had always known. But at the same time, he had done something that changed countless lives forever. For my family, that night was never just a story from the news. It was connected to people we knew. It was connected to my brother's memories. It was connected to my sister losing people she cared about. And it was connected to years of hearing a phone ring during family dinners, knowing that the voice on the other end belonged to someone who had caused so much pain. Some events never really leave you. Even after years pass, they stay in your mind because they remind you that sometimes the people closest to you can hide things you never thought possible. That sleepover was supposed to be just another teenage memory. Instead, it became the night everything changed. There are some moments in life that seem completely random at the time, but later you look back and realize how strangely connected they were. A couple in my town was once riding their bikes along a frontage road when they were struck and killed in a hit-and-run accident. The driver didn't stop. They just left. The businesses on that side of the road didn't have cameras that captured what happened, so investigators had very little to work with. However, the late-night fast food restaurants across the highway did have cameras facing toward the area. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify the driver or the exact vehicle, but investigators were able to determine one detail. The car involved appeared to be a light-colored sedan. That was it. A light-colored sedan. There wasn't much else to go on. Time passed, and eventually the case seemed to fade into the background. Like many small-town tragedies, people remembered it, but without new information, there wasn't much anyone could do. About a year later, something happened that I still think about. A friend of mine matched with a guy on a dating app. Since it was her first time meeting him in person, she didn't want to go alone. She asked me if I wanted to come along and smoke with them so she would feel more comfortable. I agreed. When I met him, I ended up getting into his car. It was a light-colored sedan. The second I got inside, something felt off. I couldn't explain it. There was nothing specific I could point to. He didn't say anything that immediately made me suspicious. There wasn't some obvious warning sign. It was just a feeling. Something about him made me uncomfortable. I remember sitting there thinking that something about the situation didn't feel right. But because I had no reason to believe anything was wrong, I eventually brushed it off. I never saw him again after that. Life moved on. Another year or so passed, and I was working at a hotel with a few people I knew from school and some family friends. It was a small enough town where everyone seemed connected somehow. Most people knew each other, or at least knew someone who did. Around that time, the anniversary of the hit and run was approaching. One of my coworkers, who was also a close family friend, started talking about the case. She mentioned that she had always been suspicious of someone she used to work with. She said there was something about him that had always seemed strange. The more she thought about it, the more details started to bother her. She remembered that he had called in sick the day after the accident. Then, she remembered that shortly after the incident, he showed up to work driving a different vehicle than usual. That caught her attention because she knew he normally drove a light-colored sedan. When she asked him about it, he explained that he had taken his regular car to a family friend who lived a few hours away. According to him, he had hit a deer the night before and didn't want to take the car to a repair shop because his friend could fix it for cheaper. At the time, that explanation might have sounded reasonable. But when you put all the details together, it became harder to ignore. The timing, the different car, the story about hitting a deer on the same night as the hit and run, the fact that the vehicle matched the only description police had been able to get from the camera footage. My coworker was not someone who avoided difficult conversations. She was direct and didn't have a problem asking questions when something didn't add up. So she eventually brought up the hit and run with him. I don't remember exactly what she said, but she questioned him about it. After that shift, he quit. Nothing ever officially came from it. There was never enough evidence to prove anything. The years had passed, and by then there wasn't much investigators could do. A suspicion, even a strong one, isn't enough without evidence. The case remained unresolved. I don't even remember his name anymore. But I still remember his face. I remember sitting in that light-colored car and looking at him. I remember the strange feeling I had that something wasn't right. At the time, I had no idea why I felt that way. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Or maybe, somehow, I was sitting next to someone connected to something terrible that happened in my own town. I'll probably never know the truth, but I have never forgotten that moment. Sometimes the things that stay with you aren't the dramatic moments. Sometimes it's just a face, a feeling, a small detail that doesn't make sense until years later. And even now, whenever I think about that unsolved hit and run, I still remember looking into that rearview mirror and seeing him looking back at me